In war, the rules are written in ink, but victory is etched in steel. That's what they say, anyway. But this isn't a story about steel. This is a story about a heresy. A beautiful, audacious heresy built from plywood and glue. It's the story of an airplane that, by all logical accounts, should never have worked, and the quiet mechanic who broke every rule in the book to turn it into an untouchable legend. Let's be clear. In 1938, as the world held its breath on the brink of war, British de Havilland's proposal was considered, to put it politely, absurd. In an age where military thinkers dreamed of gleaming metal fortresses bristling with guns, he walked into the British Air Ministry with an idea for a bomber. A bomber built almost entirely from wood. A bomber with no gun turrets, no tail gunner, no defensive armament whatsoever. Its only defense? To be so blindingly fast that nothing could catch it. The response from the men in charge was predictable. A polite, but firm, "No. Thank you." You could almost hear their thoughts. Wood? Wood belongs to the Great War, to biplanes and canvas held together with hope and piano wire. The future is metal, sir. Britain was facing a grim arithmetic problem. The nation was rearming at a frantic pace, but aluminum was scarce. It was rationed, fought over by every branch of the military demanding Spitfires, Hurricanes, and heavy bombers. But de Havilland's genius wasn't just in designing aircraft, it was in seeing opportunity where others saw only limitation. His company had spent decades mastering a unique construction method, creating a sort of super plywood. They took thin sheets of birch and bonded them to a lightweight core of Ecuadorian balsa wood, with Canadian spruce for strength, all held together by a special casein glue originally developed for the furniture industry. The result was a material that was incredibly light, remarkably strong, and, most importantly, could be built by people who had never touched a metal airframe in their lives. The Mosquito wouldn't be built in the strained aircraft factories. It would be assembled by cabinet makers, piano builders, and furniture craftsmen, skilled artisans whose peacetime trades had been sidelined by the war. It was a war machine that wouldn't steal a single sheet of precious aluminum from the Spitfire production line. It was a brilliant, elegant solution, born from pure necessity. The design that finally emerged from their small workshop in late 1939 was audacious. It was beautiful, a sleek, streamlined fuselage with a 54-foot wingspan, powered by two of the most legendary engines ever built. The Rolls-Royce Merlins, the very same power plants that gave the Spitfire its iconic snarl. Inside the cramped cockpit, there was just the pilot and the navigator, two men sitting side by side, betting their lives on de Havilland's mathematics. On November 25th, 1940, the first prototype, painted a loud, optimistic training yellow, rolled onto the airfield at Hatfield. Test pilot British de Havilland Jr. eased the throttles forward. The two Merlins roared to life, and the Mosquito did something no one truly expected. It didn't just climb, it leaped into the air. The plane felt alive, eager. By February 1941, the official trials at the Boscombe Down Experimental Airfield confirmed that the numbers weren't just fantasy. At 22,000 feet, the wooden prototype, heavy with test equipment and with its engines not yet fully optimized, touched 392 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, the brand new Spitfire MK5, the pride of the RAF, struggled to hit 370 miles per hour at the same altitude. This wooden bomber, with no guns, was faster than any fighter currently in service anywhere in the world. The Air Ministry's skepticism didn't just crack, it shattered. The heresy was real, and it was spectacular. They called it the Wooden Wonder, but victory in the sky isn't won on a test field. By late 1942, the Mosquito was flying deep into the heart of Germany, conducting lightning-fast daylight raids that left the enemy stunned. They were fast, yes, but they weren't quite fast enough. The German Luftwaffe were not idiots. They were masters of adaptation, and their answer to the Mosquito was coming online. The Focke-Wulf 190, a brutal piston-engine killer, and the latest variants of the legendary Messerschmitt 109G. These were formidable machines, and German pilots were learning how to counter the Mosquito's speed. Interceptions became uncomfortably frequent. A Mosquito crew might still outrun its pursuers over the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, but the margin was thinning. It was getting closer. Pilots started returning to base with stories that chilled the blood. Stories of tracer rounds stitching the air just a little too close for comfort. Of desperate dives that barely opened the distance. Of Merlin engines screaming at emergency power that still wasn't quite enough. The Wooden Wonder had proven Geoffrey de Havilland's vision correct. It was a masterpiece. But now, it needed something more. Something the design office hadn't anticipated, and something the official manuals strictly forbade. It needed someone willing to read between the lines of engineering tolerances. Someone who saw not limits, but possibilities. It needed a man who understood that the rules, so carefully written in the safety of peacetime, might not be enough to survive the brutal reality of war. It needed a quiet hero, not in the cockpit, but on the workshop floor. The answer to the Mosquito's growing vulnerability wasn't found in a high-tech design office in Hatfield or a stuffy boardroom in the Air Ministry. It was found in a place that smelled of oil, metal, and cold English tea. It was found on the concrete floor of a maintenance hangar at RAF Marham, a sprawling bomber base in the flat, windswept countryside of Norfolk. And it was found by a man who wasn't supposed to change a thing. His name was Roderick Banks. In 1942, he was a flight sergeant, a fitter. Not an engineer, a distinction the Royal Air Force hierarchy took very seriously. His world was one of execution, not innovation. His job was to follow the book. When a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine came into his workshop after a set number of hours, his task was clear. Strip it down, inspect every component for wear, replace what was worn, reassemble it precisely to specification, sign the logbook, send the engine back to the flight line. The entire system, the entire air war, worked because men like Banks followed instructions with unwavering precision. Except, Roderick Banks had a peculiar habit. He read everything. It wasn't just the maintenance manuals, the laminated pages smudged with grease that told him which bolt to tighten and to what torque. Banks read the things most other fitters ignored. The dense, dry engineering specifications that Rolls-Royce included with every engine delivery. These were documents filled with thermodynamic calculations, metallurgical tables, and performance charts, the kind of stuff that would put most people to sleep. But during his meal breaks, while other men chatted or smoked, Banks would sit with a cup of tea and study them, tracing the logic behind boost limits and fuel mixture ratios. He wasn't just some guy with a wrench. He had a history with these engines. Before the war, he had been an apprentice at Rolls-Royce's main factory in Derby, starting in 1935. For 4 years, he had watched the Merlin engine evolve, from early prototypes to the magnificent power plants being fitted to Spitfires. He hadn't just learned how to fix them. He understood them on a fundamental level, an almost intuitive level, that was highly unusual for a man wearing a sergeant's stripes. He didn't just see a collection of parts. He saw a living, breathing system of controlled explosions. And in early 1943, in the dry technical data, Banks noticed something. A subtle discrepancy. A secret hidden in plain sight. The Merlin engine manual was explicit. It specified the maximum boost pressures, the amount of pressurized air and fuel mixture being forced into the cylinders. These limits were sacred. Go beyond them, the book warned, and you risked catastrophic engine failure. Shattered connecting rods, melted pistons, an engine tearing itself apart at 20,000 feet over enemy territory. But the engineering data, the raw numbers from the factory, told a slightly different story. Banks saw that the components themselves, the actual metal pistons and bearings and crankshafts, were theoretically strong enough to withstand more pressure. Not a lot more, but enough. Enough to matter, he suddenly understood. The limit in the manual wasn't the absolute physical breaking point of the engine. It was a guarantee. It was a corporate safety margin. Rolls-Royce had to build in a massive buffer. They had to account for thousands of engines, operating in every condition imaginable. In the scorching heat of the North African desert, in the freezing cold of the North Atlantic, they had to assume the fuel quality might vary. that maintenance at a forward airstrip might be rushed, that a terrified 20-year-old pilot in the heat of combat might jam the throttles forward with no mechanical sympathy. The limit wasn't about what the metal could survive in a perfect world. It was about what Rolls-Royce could promise in an imperfect one. Banks, however, worked in a more controlled environment. He knew the history of every engine in his workshop. He knew which ones were freshly overhauled, which ones were running perfectly. And he started to wonder what would happen if you deliberately, carefully, ate into that safety margin. Just a little. On an engine you knew was in pristine condition. The mathematics were seductive. The Merlin engine's power output was directly related to its manifold pressure, the boost. Increase that boost by just 2 pounds per square inch, or psi, and the calculations showed you'd gain roughly 100 extra horsepower. On a lightweight airframe like the Mosquito, that translated to an additional 15, maybe 20, miles per hour at altitude. It doesn't sound like much. But in the deadly geometry of a high-speed aerial pursuit, 15 miles per hour is a lifetime. It's the difference between escaping into the clouds and your tail exploding into a ball of fire. It was the difference between a successful evasion and a very short combat career, but Banks knew it wasn't that simple. This was a dangerous game. Push too much boost through an engine, and you invite a demon called detonation. That's when the fuel-air mixture explodes violently and prematurely, instead of burning smoothly. It hammers the pistons with shockwaves that can crack solid metal in seconds. The Merlin used high-quality 100-octane fuel, which was designed to resist detonation, but that protection wasn't infinite. Banks realized the secret wasn't just about more pressure, it was about balance. He saw that the key was precise fuel mixture control. If you ran the engine too lean, too much air, not enough fuel, the cylinder temperatures would skyrocket, guaranteeing detonation. But if you ran it slightly richer, the extra fuel wouldn't just burn. It would evaporate inside the cylinder, acting as a coolant, pulling heat away from the piston crown. The sweet spot was narrow, and it shifted with altitude and power settings. He had to test the theory. He started small, in secret. A single Merlin engine, scheduled for a complete overhaul, became his laboratory. He carefully adjusted the boost control unit, a tiny, seemingly insignificant recalibration that told the engine its new maximum limit was 2 pounds per square inches higher. Then, he adjusted the carburetor, ever so slightly enriching the fuel mixture at high power settings, adding that crucial internal cooling. He mounted the modified engine on a test stand in the workshop. When he ran it up, the Merlin howled with a fury he had never heard before. At pressures the official Rolls-Royce manuals classified as emergency only. He sustained it for minutes, not seconds. He watched the gauges obsessively. Temperatures climbed, yes, but they stayed just within the tolerance limits. Nothing shattered. Nothing melted. The evidence was right there in front of him, screaming in a torrent of controlled power. But proof on a test stand is one thing. Convincing anyone to bolt this illegal engine to an operational aircraft and fly it over Germany was something else entirely. RAF engineering officers lived in absolute terror of unauthorized modifications. Every single change, no matter how small, required approval through a chain of command that moved at a glacial, bureaucratic pace. There were committees that reviewed other committees, and risk assessments had to be filed in triplicate. Banks's modification existed in a dangerous grey area. It wasn't explicitly forbidden, because the rulebook never conceived that a sergeant in the field would even dare to try something like this. But it was absolutely, unequivocally, unsanctioned. He had the solution that could save lives. But to use it, he needed an advocate. He needed a pilot. Someone with enough guts and enough disrespect for red tape to gamble their career and their life on a fitter's intuition. A theory, no matter how brilliant, is just a collection of numbers on a page until it's tested in the real world. For Roderick Banks, that test required a partner. He found one in squadron leader Peter Channer, a man who flew a Mosquito like he was born in it. Channer was a veteran of 3 combat tours. a man who had seen enough friends die to develop a healthy disrespect for caution when survival was on the line. More importantly, he carried a fresh, bitter memory. Just weeks earlier, in February 1943, he'd been on a sortie over Cologne when a new Messerschmitt 109G had almost gotten him. The German fighter had clung to his tail during the escape, so close that Channer could clearly see the pilot's oxygen mask. He only survived through a terrifying high-G dive that nearly ripped the wings off his wooden aircraft. The memory of that German pilot's silhouette made him very receptive when a quiet fitter from the maintenance hangar came to him with a wild theory about safety margins. Banks laid it all out: the data, the calculations, the test stand results. Channer, a pilot, not an engineer, didn't care about the thermodynamics. He cared about one thing. Will it make me faster? Yes, sir, Banks said, but it's not authorized. If an engine fails, Channer cut him off. He looked Banks dead in the eye, and in that moment an alliance was forged. Sergeant, he said, his voice low and pragmatic, if it works, it's not illegal. It's initiative. If it fails, well, then it's your bloody neck, isn't it? That was all the approval Banks needed. They chose a Friday evening, when the station's chief engineering officer, a man who lived and died by the rulebook, was away for the weekend. Under the dim lights of the hangar, Banks and two trusted riggers he'd sworn to secrecy went to work. The operation felt less like maintenance and more like a conspiracy. Their target was Mosquito serial number DZ-414, Channer's assigned aircraft. The modifications themselves were elegant in their simplicity, almost surgical. Banks wasn't rebuilding the engine, he was re-educating its brain. The first step was the boost control system. Deep inside a small, unassuming metal box was a barometric capsule and a tiny, calibrated spring, no bigger than his thumbnail. This spring told the engine how much boost was safe. Banks carefully removed the conservative Rolls-Royce spring and replaced it with a slightly softer one he had selected. It was a fractional change, but it shifted the maximum allowed boost from 18 pounds per square inches up to 20. It was like telling the engine that the old red line on the gauge was now just a friendly suggestion. Next, the fuel mixture. This was more delicate. Using specialized tools, he replaced the main jet in the carburetor with one that was a single drill size larger. It was a minuscule difference, but it would increase fuel flow by about 8% at full throttle. This wasn't about adding power directly. This was about survival. He was buying the pistons a lifeline of cool, evaporating fuel to protect them from the hellish heat of the increased pressure. Finally, he adjusted the magneto timing, advancing the spark just a few degrees. This would squeeze a little more energy out of each combustion cycle, but it also increased the mechanical stress on the engine's core. It was the riskiest part of the modification, a step that relied entirely on his faith in the Merlin's robust construction. By dawn, DZ-414 sat on its dispersal pad, looking identical to every other Mosquito on the squadron. Only the engine logbook betrayed the truth, and Banks's entry was a masterpiece of deliberate vagueness. Fuel mixture optimization, routine adjustment. A few hours later, Channer took the modified Mosquito up for a solo test flight. He climbed to 15,000 feet, leveled off, and took a deep breath. Then he advanced the throttles all the way to the stops. He watched the boost gauges climb, past the official red line, and settle right on 20 pounds per square inches. The Merlin's signature roar deepened into a harder, more urgent howl. It was a sound of fury, and the airspeed indicator began to unwind past numbers Channer had never ever seen in level flight. The real proof, the trial by fire, arrived on April 19th, 1943, over the smokestacks of Gelsenkirchen in the heart of the Ruhr Valley. Channer and his navigator were on a daylight reconnaissance run, a mission practically designed to be bait. The sky was clear. Visibility was perfect, terrible conditions for staying unnoticed. 18 minutes into enemy airspace they appeared. Two dark specks against the clouds, glinting in the sun. Fokker-Wulf, 190 seconds. The Luftwaffe's finest, climbing hard from a nearby airfield. Their radial engines clawing for altitude, German ground control had vectored them perfectly, positioning them ahead of the Mosquito to cut off its escape route to the sea. Channa's voice was calm over the intercom as he completed the photo run, letting the cameras capture their images while the German fighters ate up the distance. Then, with the full 190 seconds turning to begin their attack run, he spoke quietly to his navigator. "Right. Let's see what Banks gave us." The throttles were already at their maximum setting. Now, Channa pushed them past the mechanical stops, activating the override into territory the Rolls-Royce manuals marked in bold letters. "Emergency only." The boost gauges surged to 20 pounds, then a fraction beyond. The Merlins responded with a visceral snarl that vibrated through the entire wooden airframe, and the Mosquito accelerated like it had been kicked. Channa felt it in his gut. This wasn't the gentle building of speed, it was a sudden, brutal shove. The airspeed indicator swept past 400 miles per hour and kept climbing. The lead FW-190 pilot, no doubt shocked, pushed his own aircraft into a dive to keep up. For 30 seconds, he held on. Then the gap began to stretch. 500 yards became 600, then 700. The Focke-Wulf was a demon in a dive, but it couldn't sustain this kind of speed in level flight. The modified Mosquito could. Channa watched in his mirror as the two elite German fighters fell behind, their pilots surely pushing their own engines to the breaking point. It wasn't enough. At 800 yards, well outside effective gun range, the full 190 seconds broke off their attack, two frustrated specks peeling away in defeat. Channa held full power for another 3 minutes, crossing back into friendly airspace before finally, gently, easing the throttles back. He scanned the engine gauges. Temperatures were high, but stable. Oil pressure was normal. Both engines had survived. More importantly, so had they. Later that day, the intelligence officer who debriefed Channa noted the encounter with clinical detachment, successfully evaded two full 190 seconds through speed advantage. What the report didn't capture, what no one in a London office could possibly understand, was the earth-shattering significance of that moment. This wasn't a lucky escape. This wasn't clever maneuvering. This was physics. Cold, hard, beautiful physics. Banks's theory, born in a dusty hangar and tested in secret, had just beaten the Luftwaffe's best. The legend had begun. News of Peter Channa's impossible escape spread not through official reports, but the way all truly vital information does in a war, through whispers. It moved from pilot to pilot in the smoky air of the officers' mess, passed between navigators over maps, and was traded between ground crews, leaning against the fuselages of their aircraft. The story of the Banks mod became a form of currency, a currency of survival. Soon, other pilots began approaching Channa with quiet questions, and Channa would just nod, a knowing look in his eye, and point them in the direction of a certain maintenance hangar and a quiet flight sergeant. By May 1943, 3 more Mosquitoes at Marham had received Banks's secret treatment. By June, he was spending his evenings working on engines from other squadrons, his workshop becoming an unofficial, unsanctioned performance centre, a mecca of speed. The modifications remained technically illegal, a flagrant violation of RAF engineering doctrine. But a strange, unspoken agreement began to form. Station commanders, men with eagles on their shoulders and the weight of their crew's lives on their minds, started practicing a form of strategic ignorance. They cared far more about their aircraft returning from a mission than they did about regulatory perfection. As long as the combat reports kept showing successful missions and fewer losses, they were content to not ask too many questions about why their Mosquitoes were suddenly performing so well, and the reports were undeniable. On June 17th, a modified Mosquito outran 3 Messerschmitt 109 G6 seconds over Hamburg in broad daylight. On July 3rd, another escaped a determined chase by the aircraft of Kurt Bulligan, a German ace with over 100 victories who knew exactly how to hunt a bomber. Even he couldn't catch it. On August 22nd, a crew limping home on one engine after taking flak damage used Banks's modifications on their single remaining Merlin to stay ahead of 2 fighters that should have finished them off with ease. While Banks's legend grew in the hangars of England, A very different reaction was taking shape across the North Sea, in the opulent halls of the Third Reich. The man in charge of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, was becoming apoplectic. For Göring, the Mosquito wasn't just a military problem, it was a personal humiliation. He had promised his Führer that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the heart of the Reich. Now, these plywood bombers were appearing over Berlin in broad daylight, photographing government buildings, and then vanishing before his best fighters could even get to altitude. It was a mockery of his promise. A mockery of German air superiority. During one technical briefing, Göring's famous theatrical rage boiled over. He slammed his fist on a grand table and bellowed at his stunned engineers, demanding to know why his elite fighters couldn't catch what he called British furniture. He famously raged, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy." The British have built a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is knocking out. That rage filtered down into desperate, urgent directives. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf were ordered to extract more speed, any speed, from their existing fighters. German engineers knew the problem. The Mosquito at altitude was just at the edge of their fighters' performance envelope. Maddeningly close, but aviation doesn't award points for getting close. Their first instinct was to try and mimic Banks's approach, even though they didn't know who he was. Fighter units in the field began experimenting with unauthorized boost increases on their Daimler-Benz and BMW engines, searching for that extra margin of power. The results were catastrophic. Unlike the conservatively rated, robustly built Rolls-Royce Merlin, the German engines were already running closer to their absolute limits. Compounding this, by 1944, Allied bombing was relentlessly disrupting German industry. Material quality was declining, and skilled labor was being replaced by forced labor. The engines coming off the production lines lacked the flawless tolerances of their predecessors. When German fitters tried to push them harder, they didn't bend, they broke. Bearings failed, pistons cracked, connecting rods punched clean through crankcase walls. A Messerschmitt disintegrating over its own airfield because its pilot demanded too much became a terrifying lesson in what not to do. The German problem wasn't just engineering, it was a crumbling industrial base. Banks could rely on a steady supply of perfectly manufactured Rolls-Royce parts. His German counterparts were working with flawed materials and inconsistent quality control. Official German efforts were more sophisticated, but too late. Messerschmitt developed the 109G10 with an engine that could produce a massive 2,000 horsepower for short bursts. Focke-Wulf created the incredible TAR 152, a high-altitude interceptor that could reach a blistering 472 miles per hour. But these were wonder weapons that arrived in handfuls in the final chaotic months of the war. They were too few and too late to make a strategic difference. While the Luftwaffe was chasing its tail, Banks's Whisper network was winning the war of innovation. The statistics compiled by RAF analysts told the story in cold, hard numbers. Between the summer of 1943 and the spring of 1944, Mosquito squadrons flying the most dangerous deep penetration missions were compared. The results were staggering. Mosquitoes with Banks-modified engines were returning from sorties that standard aircraft simply didn't survive. The loss rate for the modified machines ran at less than half that of standard Mosquitoes flying the same types of missions. Think about that. Your chances of coming home, of seeing your family again, were literally doubled, all because a quiet sergeant in a greasy workshop had dared to read the fine print and bend the rules. Survival created experience. Experience created better crews, and better crews delivered better bombing results. It was a virtuous cycle, a secret weapon born not in a lab, but in a hangar. The wooden wonder was now faster, deadlier, and more untouchable than its creators had ever dreamed possible. But this newfound power, this illegal advantage, was about to reveal its own terrible price. The legend of the Banks mod was cemented by missions that bordered on suicidal. The most famous was Operation Jericho. On February 18, 1944, a force of Mosquitoes was sent on an audacious, low-level daylight raid to blow open the walls of a prison in Amiens, France. The goal was to free captured members of the French resistance who were scheduled for execution by the Gestapo. It was a mission that demanded surgical precision at treetop height, followed by a desperate 40-minute dash back to the coast through a swarm of alerted German fighters. The raid was a success. The walls were breached, and hundreds of prisoners escaped. But it came at a cost. The mission commander, Group Captain Percy Pickard, flying a standard, unmodified Mosquito, was caught and shot down. He and his navigator were killed. The other losses that day were also standard aircraft. Of the 16 Mosquitoes that made it home through the hornet's nest of Tebelo 190 seconds, every single one was a Banks-modified machine. The modifications had proven to be the difference between a medal and a coffin. But power always has a price, and the bill was coming due. Pushing a Merlin engine 10% beyond its certified limits wasn't a magic trick. It was a loan taken out against the engine's lifespan. Banks knew this. He warned his small underground network of fitters that these engines would accumulate fatigue faster. Components that were designed to last 200 hours might now need to be replaced at 150. Piston crowns would erode, exhaust valves would wear. The performance came with a heavy maintenance bill. More seriously, it came with a risk of sudden, catastrophic failure. On January 14, 1945, Flight Lieutenant David Wilson and his navigator were 40 minutes into a reconnaissance sortie over the German port of Kiel. The North Sea was a cold, grey slab below them. Suddenly, the temperature gauge for the starboard Merlin surged past the red line. Wilson immediately throttled back, but the damage was already a runaway train. The oil pressure gauge began to drop, a sickening sight for any pilot. He turned for home, nursing the dying engine while the Port Merlin screamed under the disproportionate load. They almost made it. 8 miles from the English coast, the starboard engine seized completely with a final, grinding shudder. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Wilson had no choice. He wrestled the crippled bomber down into the icy waves of the North Sea. The impact was brutal. They were found 90 minutes later by an air-sea rescue launch, hypothermic and in shock, but alive. The subsequent investigation revealed a failure cascade that had begun with a tiny, cracked exhaust valve. The valve, stressed by the higher temperatures of sustained high-boost operation, had developed microscopic cracks over dozens of flights. During Wilson's sortie, a piece of the valve face broke away, fell into the cylinder, and hammered the piston into fragments. Those metal shards contaminated the oil, turning it into an abrasive slurry that destroyed the engine's main bearings in minutes. Banks read the accident report with the grim expression of someone watching a predicted disaster finally arrive. The incident sent a chill through the Mosquito community. It was one thing to be shot down by the enemy. That was the accepted risk of the job. It was another thing entirely to be brought down by your own machine. This was the brutal arithmetic of Roderick Banks's war. Between the summer of 1944 and the spring of 1945, Mosquitoes with his modified engines flew approximately 3,400 combat sorties. They were twice as likely to survive an encounter with the enemy. But during that same period, those same modified engines suffered 23 mechanical failures, severe enough to cause a crash or force a crew to abandon their mission. 3 crews died not because of enemy action, but because their own power plants gave out. This was the moral dilemma that now rested on Banks's shoulders. Each modification he approved might save a crew from a Fokker-Wulf, but it simultaneously placed them at a higher risk of their engine tearing itself apart. The choice wasn't his alone. The pilots, knowing the risks, lined up for the modifications. They had made their own calculation. A dogfight over Germany was a certainty, while a catastrophic engine failure was only a possibility. As one pilot bluntly put it, "The North Sea is brutal, but it isn't the Gestapo." The squadron engineering officers faced the same grim calculus. They could follow the peacetime regulations to the letter and accept the higher combat losses, or they could push the boundaries and accept the occasional mechanical failure. Most chose the latter. It was a cold, logical decision in a war that had no room for sentiment. And what of Rolls-Royce? The company remained officially oblivious, but their engineers weren't fools. Their field representatives visiting RAF bases saw the evidence. Engines coming back for overhaul with wear patterns that screamed of abuse. Quiet questions were asked, and carefully vague answers were given. Privately, some of the top engineers in Derby were fascinated. Banks was essentially running a massive, unsanctioned field test program, generating thousands of hours of high-stress data that their own peacetime testing could never replicate. The human cost, however, was undeniable. The ground crews working on these engines lived under constant, crushing pressure. Flight Sergeant Thomas Yardley, Banks's best student, developed a bleeding ulcer by early 1945. The stress was immense. Banks himself showed the strain. Photos from late 1944 show a man who had aged a decade in 2 years. The confident mechanic was gone, replaced by someone who understood, intimately, that his innovation saved lives, but also took them. The question of whether to continue his dangerous work became terrifyingly real in February 1945. A car, unannounced and unexpected, pulled up outside his workshop. A man in a civilian suit stepped out. It was Ernest Hives, the chief engineer and managing director of Rolls-Royce's entire aero-engine division. The game was up. The arrival of Ernest Hives, the managing director of Rolls-Royce, should have been the end of Roderick Banks. In that moment, he wasn't a secret hero. He was a sergeant who had broken every rule, voided the warranty on hundreds of the most expensive engines in the world, and risked the lives of aircrews with unsanctioned modifications. A court-martial seemed inevitable. Hives, a man whose name was legendary in British engineering, didn't shout or make accusations. He was an engineer to his core. He walked into the workshop, saw the Merlin engine Banks was working on, and spoke with a quiet authority that was more intimidating than any parade ground bellow. "Show me what you're doing, Sergeant," he said. "All of it." For the next 3 hours, in the quiet of the hangar, Banks explained everything. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his actions. He simply presented the technical reality. He showed Hives the modified boost controls, the larger fuel jets, the advanced magneto timing. He laid out his meticulous logs, the combat reports showing doubled survival rates, and the accident reports showing doubled mechanical failure rates. He put the entire brutal arithmetic of his choices on the workbench for the head of Rolls-Royce to see. Hives listened, asked sharp, precise questions about thermal stresses and bearing loads, and then he did something astonishing. He spread out his own files, the service records for hundreds of Merlin engines from across the RAF. He already knew. The wear patterns in the data had told him the story. He saw the cold, hard facts reflected in Banks's own numbers. Yes, the modified engines failed more often, but the aircraft they were fitted to survived combat at twice the rate. The net effect, the bottom line in the calculus of war, was simple. Fewer dead airmen. Hives looked at Banks, this non-commissioned officer who had dared to rewrite the rulebook for his engines, and he didn't see a liability. He saw an asset. In that moment, Hives made a decision that demonstrated true genius. Rather than punishing initiative, he chose to reward it. He thanked Banks for identifying performance margins that Rolls-Royce, in its corporate caution, had been too conservative to exploit. Banks hadn't discovered some magic formula. He had simply proven what Rolls-Royce engineers theoretically knew but were never allowed to test in the field. The Merlin was even better than they had advertised. Weeks later, the unthinkable happened. Rolls-Royce issued Technical Service Bulletin 184. It was an official document, sent to every RAF station, that authorized increased boost pressures for Merlin engines in specific applications. It essentially codified Banks's illegal modifications, turning his heresy into approved procedure overnight. The bulletin specified the exact conditions Banks had insisted upon. The modifications were only for engines fresh from overhaul, running on high-quality fuel, with mandatory inspections at 150-hour intervals. The grey market innovation, born in a dusty Norfolk hangar, was now official doctrine. The rule-breaker had become the pioneer. Roderick Banks was quietly promoted to warrant officer. After the war, Rolls-Royce offered him a job in their experimental engine development department, a place where his unique talent for pushing boundaries was not a liability, but a requirement. He accepted, leaving the RAF with a service record that blandly described him as competent and reliable, a description that so utterly missed the point it was almost comical. The final tally, recorded after Germany's surrender, was undeniable. In the war's final year, Mosquitoes with Banks-modified engines flew over 8,000 sorties. Their combat loss rate was less than half that of the standard aircraft. The math suggests that Roderick Banks's simple, illegal mechanical adjustments saved the lives of approximately 200 aircrew, 200 sons, husbands, and fathers who came home because a mechanic dared to believe he could make them faster. And yet, his name has been almost completely erased from the popular history of the war. The legend of the Mosquito endures, but the story of the man who gave the wooden wonder its ultimate edge faded, known only to a handful of pilots and ground crew whose lives he touched. His workshop at Marham was demolished in the 1,960 seconds. The planes he modified were scrapped, their historically significant engines melted down for scrap metal. The story of Roderick Banks is more than just a forgotten piece of history. It's a testament to a timeless truth, that sometimes the most profound innovations don't come from boardrooms or research labs. They come from the front lines. They come from the people with grease under their fingernails, who are directly confronting a problem, unconstrained by conventional thinking. Banks wasn't necessarily smarter than the brilliant engineers at Rolls-Royce. He was just differently positioned, facing a different set of incentives, where the survival of his fellow men outweighed any rule written in a manual. His story leaves us with a powerful question, one that resonates far beyond the Second World War. When is it right to break the rules? When does a single person's initiative and moral courage justify defying the system for a greater good? We celebrate the generals and the aces, but what about the quiet heroes? The innovators in the shadows who risk everything, not for glory, but because they know there's a better way to do things. Have you ever known a Roderick Banks in your own life? A quiet professional, a forgotten hero, who bent the rules to make a real difference? Share your story in the comments below. We believe these are the stories that truly need to be told, and if you agree, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories of courage and ingenuity.